So let's start by unzipping the zip. And inside of it, we should find a DMG. We open up the DMG, and inside of that DMG, we will then find an installer, which is this one here. So we double-click it, say open, and then we should get this window here. So far, so good? All right. Then we hit next. Make sure that our versions are checked here. So when it's blue, it means it's checked. I have all the versions of After Effects installed as well. So it detected that, so it would install it for those as well. Then we hit next, next, type in the computer password.
I have just the 2017.
Yeah, then install it for 17, but I do suggest updating After Effects to the newest version at some point, and then you need to run the installer again, so it's installed for 18 as well. And then it should say down here, click Finish to close the installer, because everything is installed. So we hit Finish. All right, next. That was the first thing. The other part is a little bit more manual, because we need to install some scripts. For the people on Windows, I am not like 100% sure where that folder is, but it's probably in this app data folder, and in there, Adobe After Effects. And from that folder on, it should look the same as on Mac. So on Mac, you go to the application folder, and in there, you will find the folder Adobe After Effects CC 2018. And on Windows, when you go to the app data, blah, stuff, then you should also have a folder that looks similar, where you have like essential graphics, plugins, presets, and scripts. Are we all in this folder? So the Mac people are? All right, then I will continue for the Mac people, and then I can take a look on the Windows machines in a moment. So there is a folder called Scripts, and we do also have a folder that is called Scripts. And what we can try, it does not always work, but take a look here. You copy the Scripts folder that you've got today, hit Command-C to copy it. Then you go back to the application folder here. Make sure that you don't have the scripts folder selected, but the application folder here directly. So when we paste, we would paste a folder that has the same name as the scripts folder. And then we should get a window that looks like this, that asks us to merge. And then you just hit merge. And then you should have all the things installed in here. If it does not say merge, then you need to copy the things manually over. Did anyone not get the merge window? That sounds good. All right. Did you find the folder?
Yeah.
Can you open it up? Yeah, looks correct. Yeah.
I don't think that we have
You just copy these files into that one, except for the scripts UI panels. That one will then copy them all into that. So these ones in there. Exactly, and then you open up the scripts UI panels and copy the console onto that folder. And there, exactly. All right. Did you found it?
No, I have the scripts, I don't have After Effects, I'm like, so down the So what did you do to merge everything?
You were in that folder here?
Where's the data folder?
16%.
Where did you find the folder?
That's in the main folder. In After Effects, there's a folder called Support Files.
Well, we first need to get to that. What is the first? Where is it in the? Yeah, maybe you come over here. I'm not so good with Windows. All right. So now that we have these things in place, we can start After Effects, and then we will change a couple of preferences, and then we can start. By the way, if you on startup get an error message, After Effects is not stable at all. Like, in most cases, you get error messages and you can just hit OK and nothing happens. Or you get an error message and the program just crashes for no reason, and then you just restart it and continue working.
Does it save when it crashes? Like anytime everything is saved?
Sometimes. I'll get into that in a moment. But in general, when you get error messages, you just say, well, yeah, sure, thanks for fucking up, and continue. All right. So,
I'm gonna ask if you can get the stick for
Cinema 4D.
Oh, you already have it.
Cinema 4D is in Adobe Cloud, right?
No,
Oh, it's not?
no. I'll talk to you in the break.
Yeah, we can do that
Yeah.
later.
Alrighty, so do we all have After Effects open? Awesome. Working on it.
I didn't have the app downloaded, which I just found out.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. The first window we can just close up, and then we should see an interface that looks something similar to this. Can I just reset to saved layout? Yeah. Sometimes it opens up the default, which has a lot of panels on the right-hand side here that are kind of like this minimized thing where you can click on it and it opens up. I don't really like that one. I usually work with the standard one and go from there. The more stuff that we do, the more panels will be added, sometimes automatically, and sometimes we have to open them up ourselves. But in general, we just stick to the standard layout. If you ever feel like you got rid of a panel and you don't know how to get it back, just go to the menu here next to the standard icon, and then you can say reset to saved layout, and then you should be fine. Alrighty, so After Effects is a program that is part of the Creative Cloud, and it is for animating and kind of sort of editing videos. Although when you say editing videos, you usually mean that you cut videos together. So the terminology editing is usually referred to cutting it, and that is stuff that we do in Premiere Pro. In After Effects, we really do more special things with video footage. For instance, we can track it in 3D to add texts or other things inside of a video, or we can color correct films or mask out things, and we can do all kinds of things to manipulate the video. So After Effects is, in a way, the Photoshop for videos. We will also find a lot of functions and effects that we know from Photoshop, but in better in After Effects. So even though in the latest versions of After Effects it has become fairly unstable, which annoys me like hell, but still, out of all the Adobe programs, it is the biggest and most versatile one. But before we go into the details of how it works, we want to change a couple of preferences here. To change them, we go to After Effects up here, and then Preferences, and we just open up the general preferences. In here, the first thing that we want to enable is this button down here that says Allow scripts to write files and access network. That just makes sure that if you install scripts, either the scripts I gave you or other scripts as well, are allowed to do more things. Next, I usually suggest to disable this option here, so to not use system shortcut keys, because that way you can hit, these are just the shortcuts that usually After Effects users use. What they are specifically, I will also talk in more detail later. Next, we want to go to the import panel. Sorry. In here, what we want to change is the sequence footage, which is by default set to 30 frames per second, and we want to set it to 25 frames per second. Because video usually has 25 frames per second, only in America they are different, but mostly all around the world we live in 25 frames per second. Then the rest is fine. Let's go to media and disk cache. The media and disk cache can be quite handy. I will also explain at some other point what it does and why it can be quite handy. However, in no version of After Effects this works reliable, so you have more issues than you have advantages. So I usually encourage people to not have this turned on, so disable the disk cache. And if you already have something in the cache, you can click this empty disk cache button to make sure that it's not there anymore. Video previews should be fine. In the appearance, what I like to turn off is the cycle and mask colors. Also, just turn it off, trust me. Once we are at masks, I will show you what this option does and why it makes sense, or why it's usually nicer to turn off. Then we go to the autosave. With After Effects, when we say save something, it's a little bit more like an InDesign file. So it's not like Photoshop or Illustrator where everything is or can be contained within the file. In After Effects, in a file, no files are contained. So everything is always linked, which means that the After Effects files are usually quite small. Even if you have a very large project, the After Effects file is usually not larger than like 20 to 30 megabytes. In most cases, much, much smaller. Which means that we can definitely do autosaves. These autosaves work very similar to the ones in Cinema 4D. So it will create another folder right next to your After Effects file, and into that folder it will always copy a version of your current file. So it will not save the file itself automatically, but it will save a backup version in that autosave folder. I usually have it set to do this save every 5 minutes, and then for a maximum of 10 versions. And just like with Cinema 4D, when we've reached these 10 versions, it starts to delete the oldest one and then create a newer one. So you always can go back 50 minutes. The default here is set to next to project, and I would always do that because then you always know, all right, here's my After Effects file, and in the same folder we always have an Adobe After Effects autosave folder, and in there you have all the backups. Yes?
Sorry, so in this folder everything gets saved after 20 minutes, but then do you save it separately again? Because if you want to...
You still save these are just backup files. These are just autosaves. Exactly. So you still work in that one file and you continue working, but in the background it will save a version in that separate folder in case After Effects crashes or something like this, or the file gets corrupt or whatever.
Yeah, because it says like choose a folder, so it makes sense to have one folder, just for the structure to have one folder, but the best case I'm never gonna look in that folder because
exactly.
I have everything saved.
Exactly.
Oh.
Yeah. All right. And the rest here should be fine. Mm-hmm.
But does it put all the links in this folder?
No.
As well?
The autosave folder is really just the After Effects file.
It's just
And After Effects always links elements. You cannot put something into After Effects or things will not be automatically copied in the same folder where the file lies. It's just like InDesign. When you link something, it still remains in the original place. When you move the original file, obviously the link is lost, but you can very easily relink many files at the same time. We will also go into that later. And with After Effects, you can also save out a package, just like with InDesign. So when you need to back up your project or send it over to someone else, then you can kind of copy everything together into one folder automatically and send it over. All right. Yeah, just quickly in general to this class, just like with the Cinema 4D class in our upcoming classes, we will always have a project where I will show you at the beginning of the class what we will do, and then we always do it like I do first, and then we do it together. At the end of the class, we will always have a small snippet of a couple of seconds where we learned a couple of new techniques. And some examples will be spread across 2 classes. For the face-to-face, as I said in the Cinema 4D class already, we don't have a face-to-face project because I rather want to focus on getting most out of the classes that we have here rather than wasting time on a project that is not really necessary to you. So I rather teach and give you some challenges, like with the Cinema 4D class where I told you play around, like in kindergarten. I rather do these sort of things. And as for the evaluation, I evaluate my classes based on how you participate in the class. And yes, good. Let's talk about the interface. This should look a little bit familiar, just a little bit, because it's an Adobe program. On the left-hand side, we have our project panel. In the project panel, we will put in every single thing that we want to work with. And After Effects can import almost anything. So you can import images, GIFs, videos, even PDFs and Illustrator files. Some files have additional options, like Photoshop and Illustrator files can be imported in a way that you can even access the layers and even alter parts of the files within After Effects without destroying the originally linked files. So After Effects is always procedural. You never put something in it and destroy something. Every single thing that you do can always be changed later on. It's much like in cinema, where we saw that we could kind of like create something and then we can, like we have a spline and we extrude it and then we can put a deformer on it to distort it, and we can always change the spline and the extrusion and the deformer. And in After Effects, it's much like this as well. So everything we do always has kind of like a plugin or a function that does something. It's not like in Photoshop where we do a color correction and then it's done and it's broken. You know, so in Photoshop you can work procedurally by using adjustment layers and always creating a new layer when you do retouches. But in Photoshop you can also work destructive, where you actually alter the image itself, and when you save the file then you're fucked. And in After Effects that does not work. Everything is always linked, everything is always changeable, since everything is always animatable. So almost every single property, every single thing that we do in After Effects can be animated. Even if we use a brush to draw something, then we can change the stroke that we did. We can change the width of it. We can change how it's drawn. We can change the softness of it. So we have all the settings that we know from Photoshop, or not all the settings, but some of the settings that we know from Photoshop for brushes, and we can animate all those properties later on.
Are these vectors then?
No, but it just remembers you stroked like this, and then we'll just repeat that, but with a different property that you gave it to it. So they are not vectors, but it just remembers how you stroked,
Okay.
and then it just repeats it with new properties. All right, so in the left-hand side here, you can import all sorts of files. So just to show you really quickly, let's say I have, oh God, I hope I have something really quick. I have a video here, whatever that is, and I can drop this just onto the project panel, and then it will be in here. When I select it, I can see a couple of informations about that file here already. I can see that it has sound, I can see the size of it, I can see how long it is, the frame rate, the color space, or not really the color space, the bit depth, the encoding, and the depth of the audio. So for all the files that we import, we can always see them here, see some options here. We can import as many files as we want, and we can also structure them in folders. So let's say I have some other files imported here, and these two are images. I can just drop them onto the folder icon, and they get grouped into a folder. I can also then just take them out of the folder. So this is your own sort of folder structure. You can organize things however you want. However, I do have a sort of preset structure that just helps you to get organized right in the beginning. Because as you can see, if you start to import like 50 files in here, and in After Effects you also create some more things like compositions, solids, and stuff like this, then this gets very messy in here. So one of the scripts that you have installed creates a folder structure that you can start with. I don't tell you that you have to use it, I just tell you that it's always a good start. You find it by going to File, Scripts, and it's called _folder. I have a couple of more scripts in this list, and since a couple of versions ago, this is not structured alphabetically anymore, which sucks. So you always just have to read everything and hope you find the script that you are looking for. So the _folder, when you click on it, it just creates a couple of folders here on the left. And in there you can see there's a folder for master comps and pre-comps. Essentially they are the same, but it's just kind of the definition that you give them. What it is, I explain a little bit later. And we have the footage folder, which then gets sorted into audio, pictures, and video. So in there, you can also just drag, if I have my images here, I can drag them directly onto the pics folder, and when I then open up the pics folder, it shows me that these images are in here. So this is just being organized, but you can of course use your own folder structure or do whatever, but I found this to be a lot helpful, just to find things quicker. Although when it's kind of stressful, I just start dragging shit in and doing stuff. So, yeah. But I try. We all try. All right. Did this work for everyone, this folder script? Did you see it in the list? All right.
I have had issues with it. I don't know.
All right. So in this panel, we will organize everything that we need to animate or whatever we want to do with After Effects.
Can I ask something?
Sure.
Do we need to open the script every time we open After Effects, or is it like
Yes.
save? Oh, okay.
You always need to open it yourself. If you want it to be called automatically each time After Effects starts, what you could also do is copy the script. So here we have the script, the _folder. You could copy it and paste it into the startup folder. And then it will run the script every time you start After Effects. However, if you had a project open and you close it and you start a new one, then you have to again run it manually. So I usually just run it manually. Because it's also annoying if you open it up, if you open up After Effects, you have the folder structure, and then you open up a new project, then it will always ask you, oh, but you already did something in this project, because you added these folders, and then you have to say, don't save, and that's annoying. So if you want, you can put it in here, but I found it to be rather annoying than helpful. All right. So in the left-hand side, we put everything that we need to work with. There are actually many different ways to import a file. In After Effects, I will say that a lot. So there's oftentimes not just one way of doing something, but always many, many different ways. Usually 3 or 4. I will show you all of them. Sometimes I have a clear preference that I will force onto you. And sometimes I'll just tell you do whatever. By the way, in my classes, if I tell you very specific values or that you need to do very specific things, then that usually has a reason, and I most of the times explain it. And if I say, just move it to the right and just scale it like whatever, then I mean it. Like, just move it to the right. You don't have to use the same pixels as I do. Just put it somewhere. So when I'm not specific, then you don't have to be. Oh yeah, and also in this class, there are a lot of shortcuts and a lot of steps to do one thing. And just like in cinema, I don't recommend writing anything down. Rather, listen, follow along. Usually, in my classes, I always do it first, then we repeat it together. And many techniques we repeat multiple times over the different classes. So there's really no need to write it down. You'll get it. All right, so importing you already saw, dragging and dropping works. Another thing that works is double-clicking in an empty area here. So I cannot double-click on a folder because that one will open or close a folder. But when I double-click in an empty area down here, then it opens up an import window. The same import window I also get when I go to File, Import, and File. And right there, we can also see that there's a shortcut. So when I go to Import, I can see that it's listing a shortcut next to it, Command-I. Kind of makes sense for importing. There's also a command that says multiple files, which has a different shortcut. You will never need this. Because like here, when you click on File, then I can also select multiple files and import these two files at the same time. So multiple file import just means you imported something, and then directly after, it opens up the import file window again. Then you select new file, import it, and then it opens up again until you tell it to not do that anymore. But when does that happen?
Sorry, actually, this feature it's useful if you have sequence like JPEG sequence over there.
No.
So it gives you the whole files as one file. So you don't have to just drag and drop each single file to After Effects.
You use it for that?
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
Well, there's a shorter way of doing that. Like when it's an image sequence, then it detects that sequence automatically. So you just need to select one file and make sure that the import as sequence option is turned on. And when you have multiple sequences, for instance, when you have cinema and you exported different multipasses, then you can just select all the files in that folder, and then you can tell After Effects to import multiple sequences. And then it imports all these files. So, and it all works in that same import window and not the multiple import window. All right. So these are the 3 ways. You can do 1, 2, 3, 4 ways. You can do the drag and drop, you can do the double click, you can do the file import, and you can use the shortcut Command-I. Getting rid of a file is fairly simple. You can either select it and hit the delete key, or you can drop it onto the trash icon that you see here at the bottom of the panel. So I can drop it onto the trash icon, or I can have it selected and click the trash icon. So this should feel fairly familiar from other Adobe programs. All right.
Is your trash deleted forever upon moving it, or is it one of the things that you have to click
No,
on?
it is really deleted. Just like in Illustrator, when you drag a layer onto the trash icon, then it's gone. And here it's the same. If you've linked the file in your After Effects project somewhere, it will warn you that it has been used, and if you really want to delete it, usually. But then if you delete it, then it's really gone, like it never was there. So all the animations that you did with that file are also gone. All right. Next, down here, we have the timeline. Right now, our timeline is empty because we have nothing in it. What we need is a so-called composition. A composition is a little bit like a Photoshop file in general, but it could also be a smart object. So in After Effects, we usually work with compositions, and they are our containers to put all the stuff in. Let's take a look at what a composition looks like. There are, again, different ways to create a composition. What I usually do is I click on this icon down here where it says Create New Composition. Alternatively, I could also go to Composition and choose New Composition up here, or use the shortcut Command-N. What we then get is the Composition Settings window. A composition has many different settings. For now, I stick only to the basic settings, but there are also advanced settings and 3D renderer settings. After Effects does support a little bit of 3D, but most of the 3D that After Effects supports sucks. So we will not talk about it too much, and rather stick for 3D to Cinema 4D. First, we have different presets that we choose. These presets define all the settings that you see listed down below here. The preset that is set, in my case right now here, is the preset that we will almost always use whenever we create a composition. So all the videos that you will create will have this preset. It's called HDTV 1080-25. When you look or when you click on this, you can see there's a huge drop down with a lot of different formats, but most of them do not make sense to what we want to do. In most cases, the issue is that you either have some weird aspect ratios of the pixels, or that we have just frame rates that are not really suitable for our needs. So, HDTV 1080-25. There's also a preset that sounds very similar. It's the HDV 1080-25, but it's missing the T. When I choose it, I can also see that it looks a bit different. So let's first see what the regular one looks like, so the HDTV 1080-25. We can see we have a width of 1920 and a height of 1080, which is something that should kind of sound familiar if you ever worked with video or seen a video. In YouTube, it usually defines the sizes that you look at things, or the quality sizes things. They are defined by the height, and 1080p is sort of the standard full HD file format. Then we have a pixel aspect ratio of square pixels. This is very crucial that you always have square pixels. I cannot imagine that you will ever need a different format. This is only needed if you produce something for TV and specifically for older TVs. So all the new TVs have square pixels. All the screens that we have square pixels. But TVs back in the days had pixels that were kind of stretched. So instead of filming something that looked regular, they were filming it squished in order to save up on pixels that needed to be transferred through the TV cables. And the TVs were then stretching the video in order for it to look normal again. But that's not the case today anymore. That's like ancient history. Sometimes these pixel aspect ratios are still needed when you work with source materials from very professional cameras like ARRI or RED, but I don't think that will be the case for you. So just remember, square pixels is always the correct one, and if it says something else, you probably should fix it. Then down here we have the frame rate. There are many different frame rates, and in some cases it might make sense to change the frame rate. For instance, if you have a camera that does not support 25 frames per second, maybe your camera only supports 24 or 23.976, or even 30 when you filmed a lot of stuff with your iPhone, although iPhone I think is 29.97. Then it might make sense to have a matching frame rate to the source footage that you're using. But in most cases, when most of the stuff that you animate, or everything is animated in your project, then you should choose 25 frames per second.
Will there be a lag if somebody views it on a 30 FPS when we are producing it on 25?
You will have either skipping frames or duplicate of frames. So when you have your frame rate here set to 25 frames per second and you import footage and use footage in this composition that has more frames, then some frames of your original video will be skipped in order to fit into the 25 frames per second. So if you have a smooth camera motion, at 30 frames per second it looks smooth, but at 25 it feels like every second it does like a very slowly. So when you only have like one or two short videos, then I would rather stick to a frame rate of 25 and maybe adjust the frame rate of the source video. I will also show you how that works. Or adjust the frame rate of the composition according to the video.
Does it affect the final rendered video size, the pixel aspect ratio and the frame rate?
The pixel aspect ratio does not affect the file size. The only thing that affects the file size is the amount of pixels that we have here. Also, usually, especially when we do our encoding, the MP4, we define how large it should be per second. So we say a video should be 3 megabytes per second. And then it doesn't matter if we have 25 or 100 frames per second if we tell it to only be 3 megabytes per second in the end. Next, we have the resolution down here. I personally have no idea why we have the setting there, because this is a setting that you can always change with a very simple click to a larger resolution or a lower one if needed. So I don't know why we are able to set the resolution in this window here already, so I usually just ignore this. Then we have a start timecode, which should usually always be at 0. There are only very rare cases in a more professional pipeline where it makes sense to use a different start code, but for our purposes, it should always be set to 0. The thing that we see here is a so-called timecode, and when you read it from the right, it starts with the frames, the seconds, the minutes, the hours. So down here, my duration right now says that the comp will be 20 seconds long. Since we have 25 frames per second, it would then count up. So if I wanted more frames, then I would now have 20 seconds and 1 frame, or 2, or 3, or 5, and so on. This only counts up to 24, because if I had the 25th frame, I'm already back at 0. All right? So it's like when you count from 1 to 10, then you have 10. But you started counting at 1. And usually, also for cinema, it's the same case. We start counting at 0, so we always count to 1 less than the frame rate is. So if we count from 0 to 24, we have an entire second, even though it only says 24. You will see that a little bit more clearer in a bit. So here, let's just create a composition that is 20 seconds long. Then down here, we can define a background color. This background color can either be a background color or it can be transparent. I will show in a bit what that means. For now, I would choose maybe a black color here. In most cases, composition has a black color.
Is there a shortcut to get back to the preferences once you click OK?
To these ones here?
Yeah.
Yes. Once you hit OK, you can always go back here to composition and say composition settings, and you're back onto here.
And is it easy to change the background color after?
Yes.
Is that something?
Some of the settings can be changed very easily without messing things up. So for instance, we can change the duration of our video, and that is no issue. We can change the background color of the composition, and that is also no issue.
We can't change the preset resolution, right?
You can change the preset resolution, but then it's not the preset anymore. So 1920, and then it detects automatically, it was this preset here. What you do not want to change is the size here later on. You can change it, and in some cases it makes sense to change it, but if you started creating a video in a specific size, you should stick to that size. Otherwise, it's like a Photoshop file. Let's say you have created something in Photoshop, and what this size here does, it does not scale everything up, it only extends the canvas. So in Photoshop, when you retouch an image that you've maybe cropped beforehand, you create adjustment layers, you paint on it, and then you're like, oh no, but I want to see the rest of the image that I cropped because you had it as a layer and the pixels were not deleted. You extend the canvas, but then you realize, fuck, all the masks of my adjustment layers were only in that specific size of the previous one, and all the clone stamps that I did don't match anymore. And the same issue we will have here as well. So, just like in Photoshop, where you rather want to always work on the entire image and then crop it down at the end, always work here in Full HD. And if you by accident chosen a smaller format, either say, well, I guess I just stick to this, or try to make it larger, but then you have to adjust all the animations and everything later on. They are scripts that can help you a little bit with scaling things up, but it is not really recommended. So everything that we create here will always be created for this format here, and when you change it later on, you get a lot of issues. So when you start, it's very important to already start with the correct preset. So make sure The width and the height is correct, so always 1920 by 1080. Just always choose this preset. HD TV 1080-25. I will say that a lot. Square pixels and a frame rate of 25. The frame rate can be fairly easy changed later on. However, then keyframe animations might mess up a little bit. So also there, the frame rate should be correct right from the start. But things like the duration, the background color, and the resolution here can always be changed later on. Just like the settings that we have here, they also don't mess things up. But these ones in this upper part here, they should be correct right from the start. Yes?
You see crashing and sometimes it doesn't work. Do you mean things like that?
Oh, that's so pretty.
Yeah, but
Just did okay, and I hope it goes away on its own.
okay. Some of it's computers and issues.
Yeah, but After Effects is much older and has a lot of bugs from many, many years, unfortunately. Yeah, and especially over the last couple of weeks, it's gotten so much worse. I'm so annoyed. Like most of my time, it's like I have a task that usually takes like half an hour, but I sit there for 3 hours because I just need to troubleshoot and find workarounds for all the bugs there are. It's not that bad. But sometimes it can be quite frustrating. Yeah, anyways. Things are not getting better these days, I feel. But these systems are getting much, much larger, and people are just putting more and more stuff on top rather than fixing stuff in the core. Anyway, when we hit OK, we can see, all right, so we have a little bit more stuff down here. The first thing that you notice is that we see a tab down here at the bottom where it says Comp1. This is the thing that we've just created. We will also see how the Comp1 will be added to our project panel here. Whenever we see this icon, this means it is a composition. A composition can either be opened or closed. Right now it's opened, so we see the tab here. When we hit the X, it is closed, and we don't see it anymore. It closes the entire thing. Well, great. To open up a composition again, you just double-click on the composition, and then it opens up down here. If we add more compositions, so if we click on this icon here again, let's also do that together if you want to. Just create another composition. It can be called Comp2, all the same settings, and we hit OK. We can see now we have two compositions here, and at the bottom we can also see we have two tabs. These tabs can be moved around, and a tab can be closed. Just because you close it, it doesn't mean that it's gone. It's still up here. So when you double click it, it opens up again. So After Effects kind of has its own environment. You can have multiple compositions or projects open within one single project. It's not like, or it's a little bit like in the newer versions of Photoshop where you have these artboards. So you're like, in this artboard I design my layout for a website for mobile, and on this one I have all my assets, and on the other one I design the website for desktop. In After Effects it's fairly similar. But the difference is we don't always see everything, but everything is always listed in the project panel. So everything that we do inside of one project will be found in this panel here. And we can open and close certain parts. So, let's explore this timeline down here a little bit. Right now it's empty, there's nothing in it, but we already see that there's a timeline. So we can see here we have a slider, and when we click and drag on this pin here, we can drag it to the side. And this way we navigate through the time of our timeline. But right now it's just black and empty, and we have nothing in here. Let's put some content in here. You can either drag an image in there, or we can create a solid. There are not so many things that we directly create with After Effects. Most of the time we just alter things with After Effects. But one of the things that we can create are solids. A solid can be created, again, via multiple ways. The way that we usually use it is Command Y, the shortcut. So Command Y will open up the solid's settings panel and then create a solid. Alternatively, you could also go to Layer, New, and choose a solid here. There you can also see the shortcut, Command Y. Or you can right-click in an empty area down here in the comp, and then go to New and Solid. So all does the same thing.
That's command V.
Command Y, Y. In here, we define what size the solid has, the units it should be in, the pixel aspect ratio, although usually these should be always pixels and square pixels. Sometimes we will change the size, and many times we will change the color. To change the color, just click on it like we did with the composition, and here you have the regular color wheel to change the color. Let's create something in kind of a bright color. I will take a bright green because I have a black background and I can see it nicely on the black background. Then we hit OK, and now our entire composition that we see here in the editor should be filled with that green color, because a solid is just a rectangle with a color. So that's all it is. When we talk about a solid, it is always a rectangle in a different size with a different color.
But now we're in that one composition.
We are now in that one composition. If I then open up the second composition, nothing is in here. So when I go back to comp 1, I can see here I have created a solid, and here I have not.
So if that would be picture A and the other one would be picture B.
Yeah, or it could be an entire different film, or it could be a part of the film.
Basically, you work in, you added the one object, and then
And
go to the next.
yeah. All right, so in here I now have a solid, and it has a very nice name, a medium green solid 1. All right, now that we have a layer, we can see that we can select a layer. In our editor here, we can see that we now get some highlights or some layer controls. These are a little bit different than in the other Adobe programs. So let me talk about those a little bit. Here we have these hotboxes or controls, and when we click and drag them, we will see that this layer scales, and it scales within our composition. So when I make it larger, I can see, based on the dark gray here, it gets covered. So this is kind of like just a window, just like a Photoshop file. If I make something larger, it gets cropped off by the size that is defined in the Photoshop file. The first thing that we notice is that it does not scale like we are used to. This scales always from the center, which is called the anchor point. And there's no shortcut to make it behave differently. So you cannot hold down Shift and then it will suddenly scale from the top left corner. So anchor points, or places from where you scale in After Effects, are always predefined and fixed, and you cannot interactively just say, I click here, like you can in Photoshop, and then magically it scales from there. In After Effects, an anchor point is always fixed. And it has to be like this, because everything is always adjustable and can be animated. And this anchor point can also be animated. I will show you in a moment why that is necessary. Yes?
If you scale something so that it stays in the same size, you just have to do it with your...
Oh, no, you can still hold down Shift and then constrains the proportions. But it will not scale from the opposite corner that you drag. It will always scale from the center. When you do something like this, first click and drag, and then hold down Shift. If you first hold down Shift and then click, you will just deselect the layer. So in After Effects, many things work just slightly different. So if something does not work in your case, then I maybe explain it again, or just quickly take a look and show you what you might have done different. If you want to keep the original ratio here, the process is always clicking and dragging, then holding down Shift, getting it to the size that I want, releasing the mouse, and then releasing the Shift key. And then it's constrained. I can also just scale it on one axis by clicking, well, the corresponding points here, and also here it always scales from the center. You might notice that there are no rotation handles. Like in Photoshop or Illustrator, you can just like hover on the outside here and click and drag to rotate. After Effects doesn't have this. Not quite sure why. For the rotation, we have a completely separate tool. So right now, we are in the Move tool, or it's called Selection tool. I usually call it Move tool. For rotation, we actually have the Rotation tool. However, I hardly ever use this one, and I usually use numbers to do the rotation. Let me talk a bit about that. When we take a look at our layer that we have here, we notice that there are many different options for that layer. So in other programs, we are usually used to being able to turn something on or off, or locking something, or when we have a folder, we can open it up and see the contents of it, or maybe we even have layer styles, but that's pretty much it. In After Effects, we always have a dozen of properties just for the layer in this first line, and then we have infinitely more options the more stuff we do with a layer. Let me quickly go from left to right here at the beginning, just for some basics. Here we have the eye icon, which should be pretty straightforward. So when I click it, it just shows or hides the layer. If our layer has sound, so if we have a video or an MP3 file, then we can turn the sound on or off. In After Effects, we can edit a little bit with the sound, like make it louder or more silent. We can also change a little bit with the pitch or the speed, and there are also some equalizers, but they are not so nice to handle, and I don't really recommend doing much more with After Effects than just making something louder or more silent. If you need to edit audio, for instance, if you need to get rid of noises from wind or something like this, then you should use Adobe Audition. So here we turn on and off the sound. Then we have this icon here. Right now, it does not make too much sense, since this is kind of like a single view icon. It behaves a little bit like in Photoshop, the functionality when you alt-click on an icon, on the eye icon. Do you know that function? Yeah. So. Exactly. So in Photoshop, when you have multiple layers and you alt-click on the eye, it will hide all the other ones and only show that layer. But you have to be very careful with this, because if you turn on another eye icon, then you have to manually turn on all the eyes. But you can quickly kind of like, if you have a background, you can alt-click on the background icon and then you see the original image, and then click on it again, and then you see all the edits that you've done. So it's kind of nice to hide everything except for one layer. But be careful with that. It messed up many of my comps at the beginning. And it's like, oh no, so many folders. What did I turn on and what not? In After Effects, this is much nicer. So if I have this solid here and I create some more of it, by the way, you can very easily duplicate layers by hitting the shortcut Command D. So I can have this layer selected, Command D, and just move it over and create a couple of them. If I now turn on this little dot icon, I can see how it turns everything off except for this one layer that has this solo view, or I usually call it single view, not sure why, icon. Multiple layers can even have this icon turned on. So here I can add more elements to it. So this is very nice. This is not altering the actual eye or visibility property. So you can see if I click this, the other eyes just get grayed out because this is active, but it does not really turn off the other layers. So if I have this layer and it's turned off, then it will always stay turned off. So it's not like in Photoshop where you can mess things up. Here we can always just say this should be a single view or not. Then we can obviously lock a layer. When we lock a layer, this also means we cannot select it anymore. You can see if I try to select it, it blinks and indicates Also, I cannot select it in here. So if I select this layer or this one, it works. But when I try to select this one here, it does not. So this sometimes makes sense when you have background layers, or if you have layers that overlay everything, like an adjustment layer, or in Photoshop when you have a grunge texture that you put with overlay over everything. Then you could just lock it, and you're still able to select elements that are underneath the grunge texture without selecting the grunge texture. Next, we have this little arrow, and this little arrow is very important. When you click on it, it opens up all the properties that this layer has. Right now, or not all the properties, but it can contain many different properties. Right now, the solid only has transform data. If we have other layers, for instance, a text layer or a layer that it contains a path, or if we have a video layer, then it would show additional properties here. Right now, this medium green solid only has transform data. When we click on the arrow of it, then we see what sort of transforms we have. We have an anchor point, the position, the scale, the rotation, and the opacity. For all these properties, we can see their values right on the right-hand side here. These values can be changed, much like in some other Adobe applications, by simply clicking on them, and then you can change the value here, or you can click and drag to change the value. On a German machine, it sometimes looks a bit weird, because my value here, when I go to the decimal places, is separated by a comma, but the values are also separated by a comma. On most other machines, these values have a period, and then it looks a little bit easier to look at. On German machines, not so nice. These values can also be calculated. So just like in Cinema 4D, we can click on it. So if I have 950, I could just type in /2 and hit enter, and then After Effects will calculate this for me. So whenever we see these blue values and we can put into something into it, then we can also do a calculation in here. And if I type in asterisk or the star 2, then I'm back to the original value. So you saw me clicking and dragging this value before, and you can see how this changes the ones. So as I drag it, it will always move by 1 increment. You can also move by tenth or decimals. So if I hold down the shift key and I click and drag, I can now see how I now move the tenth. And if I hold down the command key, I move in decimals. So clicking is ones, shift clicking and dragging is tenth, and command clicking and dragging is then the decimals. I hope this makes sense. Next, if you ever want to get back to the default value of a property, you right click on it and then you say reset. Also much like in Cinema. Let me explain what these different properties do, but I will skip the anchor point for now and I start with the position. I will also delete the other layers here so we don't get confused. So I have my position here and I can see that it has 2 values. The first value is my X position and the second value is my Y position. If I have a third value, then it's the Z position in 3D space. Right now this layer is not a 3D layer, but it could become a 3D layer. So it only has 2 values, X and Y. The origin from where these values are counted is always in the top left corner. And many people are kind of irritated by it because they would think, well, when I draw a graph, it always starts counting from the bottom left corner. But then again, when you look at all the other Adobe applications, all your grids, all the 0 zeros are in the top left corner. When you enable the rulers here, you will always see how the rulers have their 0 0 in the top left corner. Doesn't matter if it's Illustrator, InDesign, Photoshop, everyone starts in the top left corner, and so does After Effects. But for some reason in After Effects, for some people it feels weird. But I guess it's just because you think about positions. In Illustrator and Photoshop and stuff like this, you just place things and then you're fine with it. But in After Effects, sometimes you have to be a little bit more specific and you need to think about how values are changing and what makes sense. So if I change the first value and I click and drag it, I can see as I decrease the value, it goes to the left, and as I increase the value, it goes to the right. If I now set this first value, the X position, to 0, I realize that now the anchor point sits on the left-hand side of the composition. So 0 means that the anchor point sits here, not the left side of my object. So when we have, for instance, in Photoshop a rectangle, or in Illustrator or InDesign a rectangle, those are usually calculated from the top left corner. So when we set those to 0 on the x-axis, their left-hand side aligns with the left-hand side of your document. In After Effects, it's a little bit different, because the anchor point by default is always in the center of the element. This, however, can be changed quite easily. If we go up here, we can choose the pan behind tool, or also called anchor point tool. And with this, we can move the anchor point, for instance, to the top left corner. You can also have this snapped there. So right now I'm just eyeballing it, but I can also be a little bit more exact by enabling snapping up here. I will talk about snapping some other time as well. And now I can see how this snaps either to the center, top, or to a corner. If I now change for my position the x value to 0, I can now see how it's now aligned to the left-hand side, how I'm used to in other applications. So this position has nothing to do with the corners or the size of my element, and only has to do with where does this anchor point sit. So for instance, right now, if I change my position on the second value, which is the y, also to 0, then I can see it is now in the top left corner, because this is always the origin of my composition. Now here it is a little bit weird, because when I increase my y position, it moves down. So this is also something that many people are kind of irritated by, but again, in the other applications, it's the same. So from the top left corner, we always use positive values as we go to the right, and also when we go down, we increase the y value and we don't go into a negative position. We do go into a negative position if we go higher than the origin. So right now, here, if I move these to 2 negative values, I can see how it's now on the left and on the top of my origin. Make sense? All right. Good. Next, we have the scale. The scale also has 2 sides, or 2 values. The first is the x-axis and the second is the y-axis. By default, it is locked. However, this lock only means that when I drag these values or click in it and change the value, it will automatically change this other value. If I click and drag, it does not constrain. So if I click and drag, I can do whatever. And this lock here is only necessary or only affects the behavior when I change something down here. Here, of course, I could also say that I want here 50% and there I want 100%. By the way, you can also tap through these properties. So when I type in here 50, I can hit tap to go into the next property. I can also tap back. This is something that many people don't know, by holding down Shift and then using the tab key. So tap toggles through from top to bottom or left to right, and Shift tap goes backwards. And this is nothing to do with After Effects specifically. This works everywhere in Mac. So even if you use the Command tab to toggle between the programs, you can also use Command Shift tab to then toggle backwards the list. All right, so scale kind of makes sense. Rotation. The rotation has 2 properties, and they are a little bit harder to understand. Let's first start with the right one here, where we have a plus and then a value with a degree icon. So this really is my rotation. If I click and drag on this second value, I can see, all right, so this is rotating, and it is rotating around the anchor point. I can, of course, choose my anchor point again here and set it to the center, and now it will rotate around the center. If I click and drag on the first value, then nothing happens, because these ones are rounds. When I have 1 in here, this means I now have 360 degrees plus 10, for instance. So also if I keep on dragging this, and I reach 360, then I have 2 rounds plus something, and 3 rounds plus something, and so on. In other applications, this does not make sense, because if you rotate it more than 360, then it just goes back to 0 and continues rotating, because it does not make sense to sort of twist things further. In After Effects, however, we can animate things, and when we have, for instance, have a wheel that should be turning, then it should probably turn further than 360 degrees. And that is why we have this additional value here, which says rounds. So if you click and drag this and nothing happens, then it totally makes sense, because you're always just adding 360 degrees to it. So rounds plus whatever degrees we put in here. Then down here we have the opacity, which is just like the opacity in other applications, so we can drag it down or up, and it goes from 0 to 100. The other properties usually don't really have limits, of course. Programmatically or code-wise, they have their limits, but you can have negative rotations, negative sizes, negative positions, negative anchor point, but only the the opacity goes from 0 to 100. So here we also have the rotation, and I rather use the rotation with the number, as I said earlier, instead of using the actual tool for it. Because what I don't like about the tool, if I have 2 layers, let me just change the color here real quick. So I have a second green solid that is here in the background. If I use the rotation tool and I have my front layer selected, I can rotate it, and that's fine as long as I click on it. But the problem is, if I click a little bit outside of it, I select the background layer and rotate it. And I find that very irritating, especially when I then have layers that are covering it. I cannot click here to rotate this layer. And if I have something like an overlay or a color correction over everything, I would rather rotate the color correction or the overlay, unless I lock it. And I'm usually too lazy to lock things. So what I do is I really take the rotation property and I rotate it like this, because I just have more control over it. Also, I can hold down the command key to move in much smaller degrees, and here I can see I can really fine-tune my rotation here, or really rotate it super, super fast to very high values by holding down Shift. So I actually have more control. I think I can be more defined, and I can be much larger by doing it with the values. And I can also go to more exact values. So here I only have like my regular and 45 and 90 degrees, but I cannot go, for instance, in 10th or something like this. So I feel kind of restricted. And in here, I just have more control. These values will be accessed quite often. So all of them have shortcuts. So for instance, if this layer is closed and I select it, and I want to access the position, I hit P. When I want to access the anchor point, I hit A. When I access the scale, I hit S. When I access the rotation, I hit R. So we see a pattern here. Except for the opacity. That one is a little bit special, because that one has the shortcut T. So oftentimes you will hear me saying opacity. And that is the reason, just so you can remember the shortcut T a little bit better. You can also remember it by saying, well, opacity is kind of like transparency, just the opposite. So, and transparency starts with a T, or opacity, whatever. The reason is because After Effects uses a function that is also similar in editing programs like Premiere Pro to jump to in and out points of a layer. And there we already used the shortcut I and O to jump to the in and the out point of a layer. And that's why O was already taken. And they used the next best thing, which was T. All right. You can also see multiple properties here at the same time. So when I say I want to see the position and the scale, I hold down Shift and S. Or when I don't want to see the position anymore, I hold down Shift and hit P. The Shift key, however, only works after you already see a property. So if I see nothing here and I hit Shift P, nothing happens, because shift and something means add to what you have before. And if you have nothing before, then for some reason it does not work. Don't ask me why. It's just the way it is. So P, S, R, T, A are the letters, and when you hold on shift, you can add all the other ones or get rid of them as you like. Alrighty, now for the anchor point. With the anchor point, I will show you what it does. I will try to explain what it does. When I started out with After Effects, I did not understand it at all and I hated it. But it does make sense. So many things unfortunately make sense even though sometimes we don't understand them right away. So if I change my anchor point, let's see if you get it. If I change my anchor point here, this happens. So usually I would think, wait, shouldn't the anchor point move when I change the anchor point? Yes. So the layer itself kind of has a coordinate system. So here, if I type in the anchor point, 0 and 0, the anchor point is now in what? Oh yeah, the top right corner, because my scale here is negative. Let's take it to a positive so it makes a bit more sense. So here we can see the anchor point is now in the top left corner of the layer. So the coordinate system that we see here corresponds to the size of the layer. However, the position defines where the anchor point is in relation to the composition. So if I don't change the position, but I change where the anchor point sits on the layer, I actually move the layer behind the anchor point. Kind of makes sense? I found that super confusing when I started. It took me way too long to kind of understand it. But it totally makes sense. So when we change the anchor point here by values, it moves the layer behind it because the position defines where the layer, the anchor point is on the composition. So it makes most sense to move the anchor point actually with the anchor point tool. The shortcut is Y, or you can choose the anchor point tool or pan behind tool here. And with this one, you can move the anchor point and it will make much more sense visually. But when we take a look down here at our values, as I drag the anchor point, it changes both the position and the anchor point respectively, in order to make visually more sense to me. All right? Good. Okay. Now, you might have noticed that all these properties have these weird stopwatch icons next to it. When we see a stopwatch, this means this property can be animated. Let me show you how that works. The process is always the following. We activate the stopwatch, and usually we do it at a specific point in time, because as soon as we activate the stopwatch, it will create a keyframe for us in the timeline. Let me move the slider here a little bit so we can see it a bit better. A keyframe can have different shapes depending on what that keyframe does or how it's interpolated. The default keyframe is a linear keyframe and it looks like a diamond or a rotated rectangle. If I click the stopwatch again, all keyframes will be deleted. So not just that one keyframe. The stopwatch does not just create a keyframe, it really enables animation for that property. And when we turn the keyframe off, the stopwatch off, it deletes all the keyframes. Yes?
So they are gone then?
Yes, they're gone. You can hit Command Z to undo, but if I, for instance, create some keyframes here, just really quick. If I click on the stopwatch, all my keyframes are gone. If I click on it again, I only get a new fresh keyframe here.
Is this good or bad? That it's gone.
Well, sometimes you want to get rid of all the keyframes and then it's good. But that's just what I'm saying. This stopwatch, you hit it once and you only hit it when you want to get rid of everything, but you don't hit it to create another keyframe. So when we click it, it means this property can now be animated, and it already has the first keyframe. This is what clicking on the stopwatch does. So this keyframe, if I hover over it, stores a couple of information. When I hover over it, I can see it stores a time code, and it stores the values that my property currently has. So when I hover over, I can see 1255 and 540, and I can see 1255 and 540.5 here as well.
Sorry, how do you see it? You just click on it?
You just click on the stopwatch, and then you should see this little keyframe here.
Yeah, but how do you get the information from
Hover over. You then move through the timeline. So right now it saves, all right, I'm at 0 of my timeline, and this is my position. I could then move forward in my timeline with the slider, for instance, to 2 seconds, and I can change the position of my layer. I can now see how After Effects automatically creates a new keyframe. When I hover over it, I can see, all right, now I have a new time code. Now it says, all right, this keyframe is at 2 seconds, and I have new values. If I then drag through my timeline, I can see how it creates an animation for me. So it's not like Flash, for instance, where you have to define, bless you, a tween or something like this. After Effects will always create a transition from one keyframe to the other automatically. And it also creates keyframes automatically. So even if I am between these two keyframes and I move my layer, I can now see how it added a new keyframe here, and I move from right to the bottom to kind of the top left. By moving through the time. If you don't move through the time, it always just overrides the current keyframe that you're on.
What tool did you do this path again?
So I'm at the beginning of my timeline, and I've clicked on the stopwatch. I have my first keyframe.
Yes.
This is for 0.
Yep.
Then I need to go forward in the timeline, for instance, to 2 seconds, and I just need to move, bless you, I just need to move the layer. And then it knows, all right, so the value changes, and it creates a new keyframe with the new value. And we automatically have a transition here. And we can now animate pretty much anything. So we could also say it should rotate at the same time. So here I would click on the stopwatch, go to the second keyframe. Phew. We can snap to that keyframe if we want to be exactly on it by holding down Shift. So as I drag the slider, I hold down the Shift key, and then it will snap to the other keyframe that I have. And then I can change the rotation. And when I now drag through, I can see how it's changing the position and the rotation as well. So far, so good? You don't have to follow along. Just
How do you rename files?
what files?
Just like if you have.
The layer. If you want to rename a layer, do not double click on it. If you double click on a layer, doesn't matter if it's a solid, a video, or something like this, it will open up in a separate panel up here, which is called the layers panel. Many people make that mistake at the beginning. So when you double click on a layer, it opens up in a separate panel, and then you don't really see the animation anymore. So here I can see, I only see the green solid, but the animation is gone. It's still there, I'm just not in the panel where I would see it. So here, we just go to the composition one, and then we are back to where we are supposed to be. So double clicking goes to this panel, and then we can just either close it or go back to the composition panel. To rename a layer, you need to have it selected and hit enter. And then you can give it another name, like, I don't know, rectangle. Alrighty. So this is how you can animate something. I don't want to waste too much time, and I want to fairly quickly get to doing practical examples in our next class. So the next couple of things I will talk about fairly quickly. You just watch and listen, and next time we talk about it, hopefully remember parts of what I said. Alrighty. The next properties that we see on the right-hand side of the name of the layer here can be interchanged. They are 2 or actually 3 different modes of things that can be shown here. And these are these 3 buttons at the bottom. So I can turn it off and I can see how most of the properties here or my switches disappear. We have switches, we have modes, and we have time codes. Although these time codes we hardly ever talk about, and most of the times you can ignore those. You actually only need to have one of these 2 activated because you have this button at the bottom that you can click and then it switches between the 2 modes. Either we see the switches or we see the modes. In the switches we have a couple of them. First one is the shy layer option. The shy layer option is actually quite cute. When you take a look at this icon, it looks like a little man looking over a table with his nose like this. You see it? Yeah. When you shy layer. When you
Nothing had to say you zoom into icons.
Yeah, but it totally makes sense. When we click on it, it hides behind the table.
Oh, he is so shy.
Because he is shy. Now, what does a shy layer mean? If I have multiple layers, so let's say I have another solid, and I have a lot of these dark solids that are just kind of like, this is my super nice graphic design background. Beautiful. But I'm like, all right, so I see these layers here, but now I have so many layers in my composition and I don't want to see them. They kind of mess up my view. I tell them to be shy, and then I can tell with this icon here to not show the shy layers. All right, so they are still there. I can still select them, but they don't clutter my view here in the layers. And this is what a shy layer means. When this icon here hides behind the table, then it will be hidden when this composition shy layer switch here is turned on. All right, the next one is, I usually call it the sun icon, some people call it star. It actually has a very long name, and it means for comp layer collapse transformations or for vector layers continuously rasterize. What this specifically means, I will talk about in some other classes, but in general it means when you have a vector layer, you can actually work with it as a vector. Usually when we import something like an Illustrator file, it will be actually imported as pixels. So it has a specific size, and we scale it up, it looks pixelated. When we, however, activate this, it means it re-imports or reinterprets these vectors for each time that you scale the layer, so it will always look sharp. This has a couple of advantages, but also many disadvantages or confusions. This also works different on compositions, so this one here is oftentimes hated by people that don't really know what it does. So I talk about it when we have better grasp of what things After Effects does, and then explain to you what the advantages and disadvantages of this are. The next button here defines what the quality of the layer is. Usually this refers to how a layer scales up. This is the usual bicubic smooth function that we also know from Photoshop. So it scales up quite smoothly. It does not have a sharpen effect on it, so this is fine in most cases. This one here just adds a sharpen effect on it. After Effects pretends like it's better and Photoshop pretends like it's nicer, but like, seriously, it's just a sharpen effect on it. And this means it looks super crappy when we scale it. So kind of like if we have low poly art. If we have 8-bit art and we scale it up, we obviously still want it to have this 8-bit style and not become blurry. And this is what we can do here with this. If we have effects applied to a layer, then we have this option here to turn them on and off. What are effects? If I have this layer selected, I can go to the Effects and Presets panel and look for any effect. All the effects that After Effects has can also be found in the Effects menu up here. However, then you need to know in which category they are, and I usually forget it. I rather remember what they are actually called. For instance, if I want to add a blur or a hue and saturation and stuff like this. So we have the search functionality in here. However, so here you could, for instance, type in fast blur, and then you can find the fast blur, or anything else that has the word fast blur in it. Just much like the Shift-C in Cinema 4D, we can also search for things like within. So if I type in blur, it will still show me all the blurs, because they all contain blur. All right, so you only need to know parts of a name, and After Effects will find it. Yes?
Is there like a preview to these things? Like we,
No.
you just do it and then it ships and you
Won't
delete
we
it
see
again?
the entire thing when it's rendered? Before that, we have no view.
I'll show you one in a second what it looks like. So here, if I have the fast blur, for instance, there are different ways that I can apply an effect to a layer. So for instance, I can click and drag it onto here, or I can double click it and it will be applied. We see that it is applied first by seeing Ha! I now have a button here. It's not grayed out anymore. And I can see I get a second panel. So next to the project panel, I have the effects controls panel. In the effects control panel, all my effects that I apply are listed. These effects are calculated through from top to bottom, so they are not layered on top of each other. I'll talk about that in more detail some other time. So for now, we just know in the effects controls panel, my effects are applied. So here I have, for instance, my blurriness, and I can just blur the shit out of this layer if I wanted to. The nice thing is, it's just an effect. So I can always go back here and change this value. I can do other stuff. I can change the animation of this and my motion path here. I also talk about the motion path in another class in more detail, but I can always go back here and change this. So every single effect that you apply is like an adjustment layer or a smart filter in Photoshop. But much better. You will see it later. So, this is sort of the old school way of doing this in the effects and presets panel. You can go here and close this panel because we've earlier installed the FX console, which is so much better. What the FX console does is, it's just like the Shift-C that we know from Cinema 4D, where we just use a shortcut and then it looks for things, and then we hit enter, and then it is applied. And it's so much more convenient than the effects and presets panel. To set it up, we can really quickly do that together. Go to Window, and then pretty much here towards the bottom, we have the FX console.jsx. Click on it, and it opens up a little panel. Sometimes it's a little larger, but the contents of the panels are quite small. The FX console has also other functionalities. It's not just looking for effects. It can also create screenshots, save screenshots, and compare things. But for now, we are only interested in this sort of finding things really quickly. I don't like the default shortcut, so we change it by clicking on the cogwheel icon here. So if you did not get this window, again, you go to Window and then FX Console, and then you click on the cogwheel. Then a pop-up pops up, and we have a shortcut. I suggest setting it to Control-Tab. It just works most reliable and does not intersect with other functionalities. So here, Control-Tab, I think the default is Shift-Tab. I'm not sure. So Control-Tab, and then we hit OK. Then you can close the FX console, and this will be saved for the future. So even if After Effects reopens up, it will still be the same shortcut.
Okay, I'm really, really sorry, but it's Window and then?
Window, and then FX console, fairly down at the bottom. Got it?
From what we imported earlier.
It is what we installed at the very beginning of the class.
Okay. Sorry.
So on the cogwheel, and then we say Control-Tab. So now, when I have my rectangle selected, I can hit Control-Tab, and I can see wherever my mouse is, it now opens up this search window. And I can, for instance, look for hue and saturation. Right now it has the hue and saturation highlighted. I can use my arrow keys up and down to choose other ones. Down here, they are listed or highlighted in red because they are presets. I'll talk about presets some other time. Right now we stick to all the blue things. There's only one hue and saturation, so I hit enter. Now that I've hit enter, I now have a second effect applied here. So I can see I have the fast blur applied and I have the hue and saturation applied. And I can now change the hue of my layer. Pretty simple. All right. We will use many effects in our future classes. I will talk about many different effects from After Effects and how you can also use it in unusual ways to get usual results. And yeah, that's for now 2 effects. Yeah?
When you do like an effect somewhere later in time and you want to move it back, is this a stupid question? I don't know.
Well,
Move it back.
you can just hide it here, then it's temporarily turned off. So here I can see the effect of this effect. And when I select it and hit the delete key, it's gone. But you need to click on the name, so the name is highlighted, and then you can delete it. Or you just turn off the icon.
But you can't like push back and forth a little button you made in the bottom.
What do you mean by back and forth?
Like, if you did something,
Ah, you animated keyframes.
yeah, And then
Yeah.
push that back.
I show it later.
Okay.
Right now, these keyframes are there, but you don't see them because they are not open in the property. When you take a look on the left-hand side, you can click on the arrow and open up the property, and then you can see the actual keyframes. Right now, it's just a preview of the keyframes.
Oh, then you can reset them.
Yeah, or delete the keyframes. But when they're these small dots, you cannot edit them. I will talk about it in a bit more detail some other time. The next button here refers to the interpolation. This is only necessary for videos. This means if we have a different frame rate, or if we speed up or slow down a video, how the in-between frames are calculated, if they are morphed or blended, or they just create skip frames. I will talk a bit more in depth about that also at some other time. This here defines if a layer should have motion blur. So right now, as my layer moves around, it does not have motion blur. Let me actually grab these keyframes, selecting them and dragging them much shorter. So I have a fairly quick motion. By the way, when you hold down this or hit the space key, it plays back the animation. I will also talk about more details of playback. There are many different options some other time. For now, just hit the spacebar, it plays back. Hit the spacebar again, it pauses. So right now it does not have motion blur, so I would need to enable it for this layer. However, enabling motion blur for a layer is not enough. You also need to tell the composition to show motion blur. Motion blur in the final rendering will always be visible when it's selected for the layer, but for performance purposes, it is turned off in the editor by default. So when I enable it here, I do actually see the motion blur of this layer. You don't need to understand it completely. Just remember, motion blur, this button here, and if you want to see it here as well, turn on this button, but this is only optional. In the final output, the motion blur will always be rendered unless you tell After Effects otherwise. Then,
You don't see it when you do it now, when you press motion blur and then you press play.
no, you always need to have this second button here enabled as well. Then you do see motion blur, if the layer moves fast enough to actually generate motion blur. I will have more examples for motion blur when we get there. The next button refers to if a layer is an adjustment layer or not. So we can have adjustment layers, and actually every layer can be an adjustment layer. This is a little bit confusing. Let me first show you very quickly what an adjustment layer is. The shortcut for that is Command-Alt-Y. Alternatively, just like with the solid, you can go to Layer, New, and Adjustment Layer, and you can also right-click in an empty area here and go to New and Adjustment Layer. An adjustment layer is just like an adjustment layer in Photoshop. However, it is not defined what it adjusts. In Photoshop, we have for each thing an adjustment layer, like if it's curves or whatever. But an adjustment layer in Photoshop, in After Effects, can be anything. So for instance, on my adjustment layer here, I can hit Control-Tab, and I look again for the fast blur, and I hit Enter. This is the fast box blur, it doesn't matter. And when I now increase the blur radius, I can see how it blurs everything that is underneath this layer. What? So, in Photoshop, we are used to either having our preset adjustment layers, and some effects can only be applied to smart objects. In After Effects, it's like, do whatever. Here's an adjustment layer, and everything that you can do on this adjustment layer. The most awesome part is we also have liquify in After Effects, and this can also be applied to an adjustment layer. So here, I can just say liquify, and then I'm like, all right, so I just push this stuff here around like I want to.
Do you use it?
Yeah. And now it's a little bit like see-through glass, because when I now play back my animation in the background, I can see how this is now moving behind the distortion. Ooh. So everything that we do, or every effect, can be applied to an adjustment layer, and it's then applied to everything that is underneath the adjustment layer. An adjustment layer essentially is just a solid. So After Effects cannot create many things, and an adjustment layer is actually just a solid that is being told, be an adjustment layer. If I turn this off, I can actually see an adjustment layer is just a white solid. But it gets the information, be an adjustment layer. So everything that is underneath the solid will now be affected. If I have, let's see if I have a very quick example. Seriously?
It's only solid layers. Does it affect text or
A text layer could also be an adjustment layer.
images as well?
And images too, that's what I want to really quickly show. I don't have a PNG on my computer, seriously? There, icon. Yeah, let's just take this one here. Come on. If I have this little icon here, and I turn off my previous adjustment layer, and I tell this to be an adjustment layer, it turns off. And if I now add, for instance, a fast blur to this layer, and I increase it, I can see how it only blurs wherever there's transparency. All right? So when we have an image, it uses the transparency information of that image to mask out what that effect is that we apply to that layer.
It uses the image as a screen. It does not care for the hue or the colors.
No, it only uses the transparency. So if I now, for instance, also add a hue and saturation, and I turn the hue around, I can now really clearly see how it just uses the alpha. Yes, exactly. And this is also what it's doing for the adjustment layer here. So my adjustment layer actually has a specific size. Let me also add a hue and saturation. Oops. A hue and saturation on here and move it over. If I now move this, I can see how it's not affecting outside of the boundaries. So it's also different to Photoshop, where an adjustment layer is just infinitely large, unless you mask it out manually. In After Effects, everything always has a size. It's always a thing. And in most cases, it's a solid.
So basically, we can't use a JPEG or anything which is full capacity to do this.
Well, you could use a JPEG, but it doesn't really make sense to use a JPEG as an adjustment layer, because it's just, yeah, well, usually when you use an adjustment layer, you just use an adjustment layer. But you could also use a solid and turn it into an adjustment layer, and you can use images and turn them into adjustment layers. Or animated GIFs, or whatever, or videos that have transparency. Anyways, so anything can be adjustment layer. Next one. Here we have the 3D icon, and this means this layer is now 3D. However, this is only a fake 3D. In After Effects, the default 3D is called 2.5D. Because it can move in 3D space. So when I now take a look at my properties like the position, I can see I now have the third property, which is my Z. So when I now drag this lower or higher, it pushes actually back and forth in 3D space. We can also move around with the camera in 3D space, and the layer can also rotate around in 3D space. Whoa! However, I will talk about this in a bit more details some other time. After Effects also has a different way of showing 3D with a ray trace 3D, where we can, for instance, have text layers that are extruded or shape layers that are extruded in 3D. However, the ray tracing in After Effects is super fucking slow and not worth the hassle. When you want something that is extruded, just go to Cinema 4D and do it there. Much simpler, much easier to handle. After Effects in 3D sucks. Always stick to classic 3D. Always, if you want some flat surfaces that are rotating around, you can do it in After Effects. But if you want more, there are tutorials out there that show you how to do it in After Effects, but it's just so not practical. As soon as you want more than just a plane that rotates and moves around in 3D, go to Cinema. All right. With 3D, we also get some other properties. We can create lights and add shadows and stuff like this, but it is rendering not clean. It renders super slow, really not worth it. I will only talk about it very, very roughly. But we'll talk about the 2.5D quite a bit, because it can be really nice for transitioning effects. Next, if I click on the toggle switches modes button, I can now see how I switch to my modes. Here there are much less options. First, I have my modes. In my modes, we have all the regular ones that we know from Photoshop, plus some additional ones. I will not talk about the additional ones at the bottom here, but we see these ones at the top here. All of them can also be accessed by just typing in their name. So, for instance, if I click on this and I want screen, I just, once this pop-up is open, I type in SCR. And then it goes to screen. I hit enter, and then the screen is applied. In Photoshop, as far as I'm concerned, it also works the same. In Photoshop, we also have specific shortcuts to actually most of the blending modes with Alt and Shift. I can also talk about it some other time. In After Effects, we don't have shortcuts to go to the specific blending modes here, but it's fairly easy to just click on it, type in normal, and then it will be set back to normal. Or multiply, and then it will be multiplied, as we can see here. So these are the blending modes. Next, we have this button down here. This one is fairly special. If we hover over it, it says preserve underlying transparency. And it does exactly what it describes here. So when I enable this, let me actually set this back to normal. if I enable it, I can see, come on, here, it preserves the underlying transparency. What we see here is black, but it's actually transparency. A composition by default has a transparent background, but if there's nothing else to show, it shows me black. I can, however, turn this off. To turn this off, the button is this one here, the toggle transparency grid. So here I can see that my composition actually has a transparent background. But if there's nothing else to show, it shows me black. So, yes.
Sorry, just quickly, how do you get to that mode at the bottom? I'm still at the where you have shine map and stuff.
This one here.
Oh, cool.
So, preserve transparency means only show this layer when there are other layers that show transparency. So this is kind of like a clipping mask, but instead of being applied to one layer, it's applied to all the layers underneath it. Yeah, that's it. Then we have track mattes. Track mattes are fairly special. They are luma mattes and alpha mattes. And they define how a layer kind of is visible based on another layer. So they are like masks in Photoshop. However, I will talk about it a little bit more in depth in another class, but really quickly, I have a solid here, and then let's say I have another solid, let's make this one here really quickly, red. This is a great red. And I make this a little bit smaller. So I can say that this green solid should only be visible wherever the red solid is visible, but without seeing the red solid. So I select the green one, I toggle down here, and I see now I get the option to change the track matte because I now have a layer that is above. A track matte is always referencing the layer that is directly above it. So I click here and I say alpha matte because I want to access the alpha or transparency of the layer above. So now I can see my dark solid, even though by the layer boundaries is defined larger, is only visible where the red solid is. Let me turn off snapping, then it's a bit nicer to see. Kind of makes sense? Yes. Yay. We also have alpha mattes, where we could create our own black and white masks and also use them as masks. But they are much easier to understand when we have actual examples to show them. So we'll talk about it when we get there. The last thing in the list down here, next to the track mattes, is the parenting. We already talked about parenting in Cinema 4D, where we drag one element inside of another element, and then it affects it somehow. The parenting in After Effects looks different and also works a little bit different. In some cases, it's similar to Cinema, however, we did not explore those similarities just yet. How does parenting in After Effects work? Let me just create a new composition, and I create one red solid, and I make it a little bit smaller, and I create another solid, maybe I make this one blue, and I also make it a little bit smaller. Let's say that the red one is the parent, and the blue one is the child. The child always does what the parent does concerning transformations, except for kind of the anchor point and the transparency. So, how do I parent something? I select the blue layer, and I take this twirly thing, or pick whip officially called, I rather call it twirly thing, and I click and drag it. Then I get this sort of line that I can use to pick the bottom layer, the red solid. So I hover over it, and then it gets connected. I know that it's connected because now in this drop down it says the parent is red solid 2. So the red solid is the parent, and this is the child. Proof is, when I select the red solid and I move it around, the blue one moves with it, even though I am not moving it, or it's not selected. When I scale this, the blue one scales with it. If I rotate it, it rotates with it. If I unparent it, it doesn't do these things. All right, but if I then, bless you, if I parent it again, then it starts moving and scaling together with it as well.
If you unparent it and reparent it, will it pick up all of the changes that you made since you unparented it, or will it only pick up from that moment?
It's kind of like a child that is broken that just gets stuck in time.
Okay.
So here I see how this is now really weirdly distorted, and I unparent it, and I now move this one here, and now this one is completely lost, and it's like, oh no, now I'm like this.
When you unparent it, why does it change shapes?
Does not change the shape.
You altered shape.
Oh yeah, it sheared a little bit, that's true. Because this one here this is a very special case. Sorry for showing it. I rotated it, unparented it, rotated the parent a little bit further, and then parented it again, which means that now the axes at which they scale are skewed. And this skew is something that can only happen while they are parented. And the skew is nothing that we can do ourselves, unless we have a separate effect. So in most cases, this weird skew thing, and when we unparent it, that it unskews, does not happen. So this skew is really just a special case.
It happens within both the 2B and 2.5D, or it's just for 2.5D? That the skewing.
Oh no, this happens for all the layers. Doesn't matter if it's 2D or 2.5D. Anyway, so the layer just stays there and is now there, and it's completely independent from the parent, but this also means that this can now also move freely around. The nice thing is, or why this kind of makes sense. Let me select both layers, right click on them, go to transform and reset this. Let's pretend like this red thing is a car, and let's pretend that this blue thing is a wheel. So I could parent this to the red solid, and I could tell this red solid to go here to the left. I hit P, activate the stopwatch, and then I go maybe 2 seconds forward and move this to the right. And as this moves from left to right, I also want this one here to rotate. Oops. Like this. So now it's moving left and right, and the wheel is rotating and moving automatically together with the red one. So this is sort of what parenting means. We have a child or many different childs. So a parent can have as many childs as you want, but a child can only have one parent. Not even two. Not even two. Only one. Yeah, they have like their favorite, and they're like, no. All right, so this is what parenting means. And now we've gone through all the things in the list down here. Let me not talk about the preview thing here. I will talk about it when we have a little bit more time. And yeah, pretty much that's all you need to know. Now you can do case films. No, one last thing. Yeah, but seriously, in the end, it's really just animating properties, adding effects to something and animating those properties of these effects. And then that's it. However, there are many, many effects with many, many special things to it.
Usually.
Yeah, but you can definitely animate an entire case film just by animating position and rotation and stuff like this.
But would you do that only in After Effects, or would you use Premiere?
It's a little bit different. You can use, or you should use After Effects either for After Effects, so when you do something with the footage, unless it's only just a color correction, that you can also do in Premiere. And you use After Effects when you animate texts and stuff. But if you have a case film that is mostly just mood footage that you cut together, then you rather do that in Premiere, because After Effects is not good at playing back videos.
So basically, it could be like Premiere is like the InDesign, and After Effects is like the Photoshop.
Yes, that's a good comparison. So with After Effects, you can also create assets. So if you are like 2/3 of my case film are just videos, and I only have some small parts where I maybe show how an application works, or how a poster is on the street or something like this, then you can just create that one scene in After Effects, and you can actually link it directly from within After Effects over to Premiere and live update it. So as you alter stuff in After Effects, it will automatically be updated inside of your Premiere timeline.
Oh, and if I put in After Effects, if I put PSD
Mm-hmm.
these in After Effects, and I change the PSD afterwards, and I save it. Does it?
It also takes over the changes. However, some things are not taken over. So, yeah, I will, when we are there, I will explain exactly what works and what does not work.
Okay.
So there are many advantages and disadvantages, as
So
always.
like animations that you do yourself that come in from sides,
Mm-hmm.
line by line, is that
After
first
Effects.
created in Illustrator and then you
Depends.
scanned it and you put it in and then you just gradually
That depends.
what you
What you can create in After Effects, I would create in After Effects. Then you are more flexible. So you can create text layers in After Effects. You also have some very nice options to animate text. We will have a specific class only talking about what you can do with text layers. But you can also create text in Illustrator or Photoshop and import them as layers inside of After Effects. This especially makes sense, for instance, if you want to really individually access every single character of a text. It's hard to convert in After Effects a written text into separate characters, and it's much easier to do that in Illustrator, for instance, and then import just the separate layers as separate characters. But if we, for instance, have characters that we built in Illustrator or, I don't know, designs that we did in Photoshop, then we use them, import them into After Effects, and then we animate them there. Also there are specific classes to just those topics. The very last thing that you just need to know is, how do we actually get this out of After Effects? So right now it's in here. And in Photoshop, we usually just save it as a file. But in After Effects, we need to render out a file. Just like we need to render something out of Cinema 4D, we render out a video from After Effects. To do that, let's just do it with this super pretty example. First, you need to define what you want to render out, and you do that with the work area. The work area is this thing here. This is the work, This is the work area, the part that is right now highlighted and within these brackets. By default, whatever is in this area is the thing that gets rendered out. So even though my composition is 20 seconds long, I could say I only want to render out this part here. It's a little bit like in Illustrator when you select one element and then you say save selected as. So here I only select this first 3 seconds because these are only the 3 seconds that I've animated. And then I go to composition and then I say either add to Adobe Media Encoder, but you should never do that because that is buggy and slow as hell. Yay! Instead, you want to add it to the render queue and do a little bit more of a complex process. Adobe, and some people, want to tell you that this is the smarter and better way because you have more options. But let it be told from someone that works with this daily, it's not. So, the process is always add it to the render queue. In here, in the next class, we will set up a preset that is called ProRes 422HQ, which is on Windows you have to use uncompressed or the animation codec. In the Mac world, we use ProRes, which is much smaller than uncompressed, but also looks uncompressed. So we're fine with that. And you render this out. This is kind of like rendering or saving out a TIFF from a PSD. So you now have a merged version that you can look at in all kinds of different applications. So here, I have my Comp3, I go to my desktop, and I click Save. Save just means it saves the location where the file will be rendered to. It does not save the file there. To actually put the file there, I need to render it, and I do that by hitting the render button. So it now renders, and when it's done rendering, it will do this sound. When this happens, you can be happy, everything worked, the file is there, yay! There's also another thing that can happen, which is this sound. And this sound means something went wrong. So either you have the bling or you have the... And this means that, for instance, while it was rendering, you moved the file that it was using for the rendering. Because then it's like, something is missing, I can't continue rendering, and then it's like... So usually, bling means, yay, we're happy. On my desktop, I can now see I have my composition here. The file format that I've used does not support alpha, so when it cannot show transparency, it uses my composition background, which is black. So I get a black background here. And I see that I have my file here. Ta-da! I can also see that this file is super, super large. I mean, this is just 3 seconds, and it's 10.4 megabytes for 3 seconds. On Windows, when you use the animation codec, it will be even larger. Or if we use the animation codec. So the MOV is always just the first thing that we render out, and then you sort of have your master file. And from that one, you do an encoding with a media encoder. So by next class, you need to install the media encoder. I think it should be installed along with After Effects, but I'm not sure if it really does anymore. So just go to your Creative Cloud and install the media encoder. It looks like this. In the media encoder, we have a queue and a whole bunch of presets, and we just drop the video in, choose a preset, render out, and then we have a nice and small and compatible file. Because this ProRes, for instance, cannot be played back on Windows, and it's something that we probably don't want to upload to the web, because it's when we have a video that is like a minute or 2 minutes long, then we have a couple of gigabytes. And that is not good to upload, usually. So we rather want to use the ProRes. We could also go here and say that we want to render this directly in the media encoder. So we don't get this ProRes file and we directly get the encoding. However, oftentimes this takes much, much longer than it should, and sometimes many effects or some effects in After Effects are not supported. So you might not get motion blur, or you cannot render something out with alpha, or the in and out points are randomly not detected correctly. And this sucks. And I sometimes try it again and see if Adobe fixed it, and then I realize, oh no, it did not fix anything. And then I just do it the usual way. So rendering out the ProRes and then sending it to the media encoder. So with many projects, there are no issues. They just sometimes take longer to render. But just because there are issues, I'm just not using it. I rather have one workflow that is reliable than something that might or might not work. So once the media encoder is open, I can see I have a queue here. I can just drop the file in here, and in the list here, I just scroll down to web video, social media, and here I have, for instance, a preset for YouTube 1080p. So 1080 is our height of the video. I drop this preset onto my thing here, so now it renders out an H.264 with a YouTube 1080p preset. I hit the play button, and it encodes the video for me. The encoding usually is quite quickly. It's already done. And now I can see on my desktop I have a second file, which looks pretty much exactly the same. But if I take a look at these files, it is much, much smaller. So before 10.4 megabytes, and now just 600 kilobytes. But it looks pretty much the same. So in most cases, you can really use, if you wanted to upload it to YouTube anyways, you can use the YouTube 1080p preset. Or if you want to upload it to Vimeo, you can also use the Vimeo preset. The nice thing about these presets is that both YouTube and video will detect that this is the correct format, and it does not need to encode it for that size. So when it's uploaded, it only needs to create the smaller versions of the video, so it will be available online much faster than if you upload something else. So if you use these presets, then Vimeo and YouTube will detect, oh, these settings are fine, I don't need to do anything. It keeps the original video, and then it will be available faster. All right, and that's it. So when you want to get something out, you define it with a work area, what part of your composition you want to render out. You go to Composition and Add to Render Queue. From the Render Queue, you should always choose the ProRes 42HQ, which I will show you how to set up in the next class. You render to the desktop, open up the media encoder, and encode it there with the proper preset.
Where's the render button?
Here or in the media encoder?
Because I've got shit lined up and I don't know what to do with it. Like, where do you go? And then you render now.
Just click this render button here.
Oh. No.
I can take a look at it in a moment. All right, so that is pretty much it. During the course, or during our After Effects course, I will always switch between sort of visual effects that we can do with After Effects and classic animations that we can do with After Effects so that it doesn't get too boring. So we might do one class where we only talk about animating emojis, and in another class we talk about how to 3D track a scene and add some text in there that follow along with the camera. Or we, I don't know, do all sorts of things. Yeah, so some things are visual effects, editing things, masking things in videos, and some others are really classical animations for case films. Yeah.
Can you show us something what you did, for example,
In the previous classes, steht erst nicht vor. Let me see. Like from the last quarter. Oh no, this is C4D. I should probably go into the After Effects folders. Do I have here? No, here I had an effect where I showed how we can really easily create an 8-bit effect with After Effects out of an image. Or how are these long shaders? Where do I have some things with previews? Let me just look for .mp4. Sometimes usually I render previews that I then show.
So in what? In what program did you use?
I think
Cinema.
Yeah. The background image was rendered in Cinema 4D. The street. Yeah. Let's see. Oh no, this is a recording.
but then he basically used everything.
He lost everything?
He used
What do you use?
like Cinema 4D, but also After Effects.
Yeah, he did some case films, and the editing of the street he did in Photoshop. This is something that we did where we tracked the boats and added SpongeBob to it. So here, there. Come on, play back. Hey. As a little example there. What do we have here? Oh, yeah, I don't. That was a weird quarter where we had. Never mind. This is one example that we will do next class, where I talk about different kinds of keyframes. What do we? Oh, this is what we rendered today. This is something that we did where we did some nice color correction and we added some 3D text plates. You see, adjustment layer. Yeah. Then, do you know Scary Movie? And The Funeral?
Yeah.
Where this dude is with the twisted face? And I thought, yeah, this is what we do by just tracking the face and then using the liquify to liquefy it. Here we will use a separate plugin to create the smoke in the back. Or what was this? Oh no, this is Cinema 4D.
Is there any plugin to make
Huh?
fluids and After Effects?
No. Not.
Very small.
Well, you can kind of create some fluid-like things with particular. You can also sort of fake it together by using particular in combination with a fast blur and then sharpening it afterwards. And you can also use Newton. But it's not really fluids, it's always just fake. But I don't know really of a fluid plugin for After Effects.
I mean, something that looks like the smoke that you just.
Yeah, but the smoke we did in particular. We'll also do some more things in particular, but rather in another class. Here, a small animation of how an icon can appear. Or, oh no, that's the same one. Or how you can create an app preview. But this is a very basic one. What other? Oh yeah, that one. We looked for images on the web, like Renaissance images, and animated them, and this was the one that I did. Yeah, I just saw it and was like, they look weird. That is a weird pose.
So how hard is that? Like, for example, when she moves, you need to do the background of the other.
Yeah, in Photoshop, I constantly aware filled the background, so I cropped her out first, then I got rid of the background. And then in After Effects, we also have the puppet tool. So just like you can set pins, you can also do that in After Effects, and you can rig them and move them around. This is one example where we animated something to sound. You can do all of
I
it.
could be A, I could be C. Multiple choice, I don't want to be. All the above don't fit in with me. Not with me.
What is the
Or
usual skill level of students when they come into your class?
none.
None.
Yeah. Here I got inspired by the other side from Stranger Things, and I was like, hey, let's do the other side as well. And that was then the end result. Yeah, on the last frame I forgot to cut it. Never mind. Here's another phone example where we have a screen that we completely replace. So the screen is actually empty, and we mask out the finger, we add the reflections back on top, and we synchronize the animation of the screen to the movements of the thumb.
You added the thumb reflection as well, or?
Yeah, the reflections were on the phone already, and we just put them back on.
Ah, okay.
So it looks nice and realistic. What is this? Oh yeah, this was just another color effect and tracking the motion of the flowers so that the text follows along with them.
That makes everything look so much
Mm,
more fresh.
yeah.
Yeah.
If you can do that in frames and presentations and everything.
Yeah.
Everything looks so much more.
There's even
Here we did just also with particles, adding some snow and stuff, just to show the principle of having many different images that can move as a whole. We did not actually animate anything here. This was all just created by After Effects by twisting some sliders, but there are no keyframes in here. Here is another way of animating an element in. Hardly any keyframes are there, luckily. What do we have here? Oh, yeah, there I just wanted to add a hole in the floor. There obviously was no hole in the street.
Oh no.
Yeah. No, it's the Stranger Things file shuffle too.
So here, this is the original, and this is then the after.
I wanted to see them drive into the hole.
That's something we did not do. Or here, where we stabilize footage. At the top you see the original, and at the bottom you see what the result is after it's stabilized. So at the bottom it really looks like you have a professional camera rig that moves so nice and smooth, and at the top it looks like a handheld cell phone, what it is. That is of course always better. But even on the stabilizer you can have some small, even with the stabilizer you can have some small vibrations that you can get rid of After Effects to make it even more smoother. So it's not a waste. Yeah, these are apparently most of the things that I have on here right now. Yeah, or something like this, but this was more, oh no, this was a simple animation. Yeah.
How long do you need to create stuff like this?
So most of these things that you saw here were either built in one session, and some of them were built in 2 sessions, and some even less. So some things feel like, oh my god, this takes so long. We're here for 3 hours and we've animated 2 seconds. But it's you should not forget that I explain a lot. So if we actually do it, or if I prepare the class, that example takes me like 10 to 15 minutes. But there are just so many different techniques, and I show you wrong ways of doing something or different ways of doing things, and that just takes so long.
No, but just if you do it by yourself.
And if I do, for instance, the stranger.
Creating it now, right now. How long?
So the Stranger Things example with the blue color effect and the snowy stuff that you walk through, 5 minutes.
No way. Really?
You just need to track the footage, make it blue, add some particles in the scene, and then you're done. Then you're in the upside down. Yeah. So some things are really simple. When you know what to do, you just do these things. Especially with these effects, for us in the class, they take a lot longer because I really explain how the tool works. But when I do it, I just know which buttons to click, and then we're done. Other things, like an actual case film, usually takes much longer because you have so many different elements. You need to create transitions from one scene to the other, and depending on how fancy you want the animation to look, it can really take days. So there was this one case film. Do I have it on my thing? 1 second. How was it called? I'm very bad at remembering things. It's like I don't even know what I had for lunch yesterday. It's like, yay, I'm not alone. Didn't I?
Oh, I only had
No, I don't have it right now here. I can show you the case film another class. But it was like 2 minutes long, and I worked with 2 people on it, and it took us 3 entire days to do. And we were pretty fast.
But it was worth it, right?
It was worth it, but we had to create all the content, and the voiceover was created by us internally. We did all the art design. We really just had some information. We need to talk about this and this and that. So it was quite a lot of stuff. How was it called? I'm pretty sure I have it somewhere on my machine.
Do we mostly need to do our own voiceovers for case films?
For the case films, to be honest, it's usually fine if you just. I think we have a microphone here. If you talk into it by yourself, but many people also use this Fiverr website. Do you know it? Fiverr, and there you just look for a person that makes a voiceover for you for like $5 or $10, and then you have a really nice voiceover, a nice voice, good quality. And if you have a case film that is not, if you do it just for a class, but you don't intend to actually put it onto an award, then you just record it yourself. Don't waste money on it. But if you intend to put it on an award, then it doesn't hurt to have a professional actually talk the voiceover for you. Yeah.
We have an American and
Yeah, but when you get the voiceover from them, they have a studio. If you record it here, you don't really have the surrounding. If you have a nice voice, it just does not sound as professional if a professional would do it for you.
Well, then we once had a guest speech of the yeah, we once had a guest speech of the guidance.
I remembered the name. Buyout app. Wait, let me see. I'm sure I have it.